Hi there. Thanks for watching another week of Liv Makes Things. It recently came to my attention that I've really been doing the awesome game of Skyrim a disservice because I haven't made any sculptures for it at all. So this week I decided to make a dragon skull ring. The last ring video I made was the first video I ever made, and it now has over 15,000 views. So I guess making rings is probably my strong point. I started with a little wire T sort of skeleton shape. To this wire skeleton, I add a blob of clay that I'm going to end up just pushing around into the shape that I desire. I don't really add extra clay except for the horns, so otherwise it's just a matter of squishing and smooshing it into the shape I want. The whole point of these two metal pegs sticking out of the sides is this is where I'm going to put the band of the ring whenever I finish it. I'm going to work in 2 steps. Last time, whenever I made the moon ring, I made it all in 1 step, which was kind of a mistake because the ring is so small that you have to hold 1/2 of it, either the face or the band, and then it causes that part to get squished. So for this one, I sculpt the head first, I bake it, and then I'm able to sculpt the band, and I can hold the head and not worry about any of the detail disappearing. For reference, I used a 3D model of the dragon skull from Skyrim. You can just look up Skyrim dragon skull 3D model and you'll probably find a bunch of them. I find 3D models the most helpful tool whenever sculpting because you can change the angle of them, you can look at them from all sides, you can really get a good idea of how the figure looks. Turns out that dragon skulls are actually very similarly shaped to crow skulls, especially whenever it comes to the underneath along the jaw, and whenever it comes to the sort of pointed snout that this dragon has. I continue shaping out the nose of the dragon. Its face sort of grows at the front at its beak, and then it shrinks a little bit along the sides of the beak before getting large again around the head. So I kind of make that sort of, I guess, bowling pin shape is the best analogy I can think of. I make sure that the tip of the nose is very pointed, and then I use one of my tools to sort of depress in the general shape of the nostrils as well as the eye sockets. The first bit of spikes get added to the nose. There's a really tiny one at the front, and then there's a slightly larger one right behind that. And then I press them down with one of my silicone paintbrushes, which is by far one of my favorite tools. For the duration of this project, I used a bunch of different types of ball styluses. Some of them are perfect circles, and then some of them are this sort of pointed oval shape, which I found to be really helpful whenever working in very small areas because they are so small. I ended up adding some strips of clay along the top of the nostrils, as well as the brow bone, because I wanted them to be a little more rigid. When looking at the 3D sculpture reference for this, I found that the skulls were very linear, like they had a lot of lines on them, sort of ridges. They weren't very smooth, sort of like you would expect of a skull. They were very jagged and sharp, I guess, which is very similar to the actual shape of the dragon itself. So I tried to capture that whenever working on this piece. I added some of the fangs. There are 2 little ones right at the edge of the skull, and then 3 more closer to the back of the mouth. With the shape of the skull more or less complete, I can add the spikes to the top of the head. There are a couple running along the top center, and they get larger as you go to the back of the head. And then there are some extra strips of spikes along either side of that center point. After I add all of the head spikes and sort of smooth them and attach them to the actual head itself, I can add the horns. I worked 1 horn at a time, starting with the larger of the 2 horns. I ended up doing this one a little bit differently than how I did the second one. The big horns branch off halfway through. For the second horn, I ended up making that branch before attaching it to the skull because it's very hard to attach something to a soft horn like this one. But I made that little branching spot, and I worked very hard to get the exact shape of the horns because they twist in a very specific way, and I really wanted it to be accurate to the model. Along the horns, I made sure to add these sort of segmenting horizontal lines, and then I also added some scoring all along the horns. They're very similar to like deer horns. They have these sort of long ridging lines, which are actually very similar to a tree trunk now that I think about it. The sort of lines of bark is very similar to these horns. After I add on the mirrored large horn, I can add on these smaller ones. These cover part of the little metal anchors on either side of the face, and they attach very close to the eye. But I have to make sure that I add these dividing lines that are kind of like the base part where the skin folds a little bit and attaches to the horn. Sculpting really small things like this is such a blessing, but it's also such a curse. I really like making really small and detailed things, but whenever I'm actually working on it, I have trouble filming it because I tend to hold things really, really close to my face whenever I work on them, which means that I can't actually film what I'm doing whenever I'm doing this super detail work. So these videos end up being a sort of half glimpse into my process because I get to show the things that are more broad and large. They're not super detailed, and then I have to pull away and just focus really close and do all the tiny details off of camera. After the horns are attached, I can shape out the back. It's very angular, it's very flat. There's a lot of what I would call polygon faces. There's a lot of just flat planes. And then there's also this very large hole at the center, which I believe is where the spine would attach to the skull. So I make sure to include that. After I put that in the oven, I allow it to cool while I work on the actual band itself. So for this band, I went over a lot of potential designs before I came to this one. I decided to go for the same design that's on the bone hawk ring. It's sort of rugged and it's got these sort of scales that I find are very similar to dragon scales. I would have just made the ring band similar to the bone armor, but I find the bone armor is just very bland, so I wanted to have a little more structure and shape to the ring. Once I have the shape I like and it's measured to roughly the size that I want, that still ends up being the wrong size, I attach it to the face of the dragon, and then I'm able to put everything back in the oven so it can all cure and attach together. Because I got the size of the ring a little bit wrong, I end up cutting it and then just gluing the two pieces together. I cut it at the absolute back part of the ring here, which is the typical place that you would have a ring cut if you were to get it resized professionally, like if it were a metal ring. I didn't show it here, but I end up taking off a lot of this primer because I want the edges of the ring to be flatter and just more angular. So I end up sanding the sides of the ring, and then I also end up sanding the inside of the ring because I want the inside to be smooth as well. This ring is probably one of the easiest paint jobs I've ever done. It got a couple coats of the Liquitex High Body Silver paint. After the silver paint is dry, I'm able to go over it with this wash of black. I decided to use actual black for this one because I wanted it to look like aged metal. I didn't want it to look dirty like it would if I were to use brown, like I did with Xant's helmet. So I run the black wash over everything. And then because the silver gets so sticky, I have to go over the high points with more silver paint to bring back that shine. I let everything dry for a good day. And then I did something that I've never done before. There's this thing called UV resin, which comes in this for me it comes in a squeezy bottle, and you use a UV light, which for me is just a UV flashlight, and it hardens the resin and makes it into this clear sort of hard plastic. And I did this because I was really worried that this would break, because it has the horns, which are really pointy and probably going to get caught on things. So I wanted to see if this would sort of help add some strength to the ring. I ended up doing a test of this resin on the moon ring, and it turned out really good. So I was like, okay, this will be fine. It'll work out in my favor. So I dropped a blob of the resin on the underside of the skull first, and then I used a paintbrush that I did not care about and just basically spread it around, because I wanted the layer to be thin-ish, but also not too thin, which is why I decided to go for a straight up blob instead of painting it on like I would with other things. I did the same to the front, and then I hit it with a blast from my super strong purple flashlight. And then I also ended up leaving it in the window because the sun actually cures UV resin as well a little bit, and it takes a couple days for this to fully cure, so I just left it in the window just to finish it off basically. I also made sure to cover the band in the same resin, but I didn't fill up the inside. I didn't want to take away the size of the ring, because if I add resin on the inside of the ring, it'll make it slightly smaller, and I was worried it wouldn't fit on my finger. So I sprayed the inside of the ring with Mr. Super Clear Sealer, just so the paint wouldn't wash off, but then I covered the outside of the ring with the same UV resin so it would be shiny and reflective and strong, just like the head of the skull. With the resin set, I think we can get on to the final shots. I hope you couldn't hear the bird in my backyard while I was recording this. There's one little bird that kept tweeting and tweeting. I'll see you next time for a pretty big project that I'm super excited to start working on. See ya!